Let's return now to John chapter 1, verse 1. Now I'm reading from the King James Version, not the New World Translation. So this is, as you know, all the verses I've been reading, this is from the King James Version. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then if you skip down to verse 14, it says, And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So who was made flesh and dwelt among us? Jesus. So the Word in verse 1 is Jesus. And what does it say? It says, the Word was God in the beginning. So John's Gospel says unmistakably that Jesus is God. Now, in verse 14, and I know the New World Translation isn't translated that way, but any good translation will translate it similarly to the King James. And if if you want to argue with the New World Translation being a good translation, go and watch the videos in this series dealing with the New World Translation. So I established first that the New World Translation is unreliable, particularly with respect to this verse, and now I'm giving a more reputable translation, namely that of the King James. So the Word, Jesus, was and is God. But then in verse 14, it says that that Jesus, it says, and we beheld his glory, the glory of Jesus, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father. So it says that Jesus, in verse 14, has the same glory as the Father. But in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, Jehovah says, Jehovah is speaking in the book of Isaiah, and he says, I will not share my glory with another. So the conclusion is that Jesus, if he has the same glory as Jehovah, he must be Jehovah. Okay? Now, he's not the Father, that's true, but he is God. Jesus is God. Why? Because he has, well, it says so explicitly in verse 1. In verse 14, it says it by implication, because Jesus there is said to have the same glory as the Father, and the Father, Jehovah, will not share his glory with anyone. So Jesus is Jehovah, Jesus is God. Then in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 8, we read, But unto the Son, with a capital S, S-O-N, Jesus, the Son, but unto the Son he saith, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. So, this is God speaking to his Son, to Jesus, and he says, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. Okay, so Jesus there is said to be God, explicitly. Then in Revelation 1:8, so John 1:1, Hebrews 1:8, and finally Revelation 1:8, we read the following. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. So that's Jesus speaking. Jesus saying of himself, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending. Okay, well, if Jesus is the beginning and the ending, he's all things, only Jehovah is all things. Jesus is Jehovah. And I think Jehovah actually explicitly says, the Father explicitly says, in the Old Testament, I am Alpha and Omega. I believe it's in Isaiah, but don't quote me on that. And it says that this is what the Lord says. Well, who is the Lord? Jehovah, God is the Lord. But yet this is Jesus saying it. So when it says, thus saith the Lord, in this case, it's also thus saith Jesus. So Jesus is God. Then it says, which is, which was, and which is to come. So that seems to mean that Jesus is eternal. He's without beginning, he's without ending. If he is the first creation of the Father, of Jehovah, then he's not eternal. He had a beginning. But that's denied by the book of Revelation. It says that he is eternal. And then finally, the Almighty in verse 8. Well, if Jesus is the Almighty, then there's only one Almighty, first of all, Jehovah. And who is the Almighty? The Almighty is God. Jesus is God, according to Revelation chapter 1, verse 8. So there's 3 verses, where the Bible explicitly says that Jesus is God. And then we already looked in previous videos at some other verses, where Jesus himself is claiming to be divine. So the Bible then, we may conclude, teaches that Jesus is in fact God. So that's 8 verses altogether, and that's John chapter 10 verses 22 through 33, John chapter 8 verses 49 through 59, Matthew chapter 9 verses 2 through 8, Matthew chapter 26 verses 57 through 66, John chapter 20 verses 24 through 29, John chapter 1 verse 1 and 14, Hebrews chapter 1 verse 8, and the 8th verse is Revelation chapter 1 verse 8. These 8 verses, each one of them, teaches that Jesus is God. The Bible as a whole, we may conclude, teaches that Jesus is in fact God. Okay, so the last thing to look at with respect to the deity of Jesus are verses that you as a Jehovah's Witnesses may want to appeal to deny the deity of Jesus. And deity of Jesus, or divinity of Jesus, or Jesus is divine, these are all different ways of saying that Jesus is Jehovah. And again, I'm not saying that Jesus is the Father. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays to the Father. So he's obviously not the same person as the Father. This is getting into the doctrine of the Trinity, and if you want to hear what I have to say about that, again, go and watch the videos on the Trinity, 6 period space God, the series called, by that title. I think there's 7 videos that lay out in great detail that the doctrine of the Trinity is taught in the Bible, and what that doctrine of the Trinity is. And it allows us to say that Jesus is Jehovah, but a different person from the Father. Okay, so verses that seem to teach that Jesus is not divine are what we're going to look at next.